I am a cultural competency consultant, technically by definition, board certified sexologist. So I am the go-between between like researchers and clinicians and educators and either the people they're going to teach or work with or study. So I provide a lot of the cultural competency. So if they're researchers, for example, are going to work with a particular group of people, like kinky people, non-monogamous people, I'm kind of the go-between. I do a lot of inclusion consulting as well, primarily around alternative sexuality. So you often have a lot of therapists who want to work with alternative sexuality communities. And so I will consult with them. I teach consent. I also teach just pleasure focused workshops, alternative sexuality. A lot of my work also focuses on disability inclusion. So a little bit of a lot of things, but I guess the umbrella term is sexologist.
Okay. What
Yeah.
would you say you spend most of your time doing?
Oh, yeah. So coaching actually has been the one that's kind of stuck out a lot. People really want to understand how pleasure can work for them, primarily if they're trying to either explore kink or non-monogamy, or they identify as someone with a disability and they're trying to figure out how to focus pleasure in a way that works for them. I think where the bulk of my work is, and then the other part of it is like teaching workshops on consent and inclusion to therapists primarily. I personally identify with alternative sexuality communities, kink, non monogamy. I live with disabilities, I have chronic pain, I'm neurodivergent. I identify as part of the queer community. So there's a lot of like intersections of my identities that have kind of given me this lived experience that helps therapists or community members. So it's a unique position I'm in, and sometimes it's challenging in its own right. So it's a vulnerable space that I'm speaking from, but I think I get a lot of fulfillment from the work as well. Like I'm creating safer places that I wish I had when I was first exploring my sexuality and liberation within it. And I'm definitely still learning so much as I go.
What would you say? I know you mentioned you're in Texas and it's a little bit conservative over there from what I hear. A
A little bit, a lot of it.
little bit, a lot of it. Um, what would you say kind of prompted you to start your own journey of exploring yourself sexually?
Yeah, I found that so much of what was restricting me, so much of these systems of oppression were focused on sex. So everything from the right to do what I want with my body, the right to love who I want, to be intimate with who I want. All of that really was the focus of it was sex. And so it just kind of wanted to demystify that for myself. I never had the opportunity to really understand sexuality as well, even from like sex ed. So it started off initially as me kind of wanting to just understand why this big scary thing was as scary and evil and all of these things as it was. And then as I started to learn more, I found such a sense of empowerment. And I found the people around me, my friends, my family also wanted to learn. And so I found myself continuing to be in a position of like an educator. I did sex work as well, and I found such surprising empowerment for myself in that. And I started to kind of see the huge need for it, and just how much even the most afraid people who are so against sex, really, they're still quite fascinated with it. And I think that that dark drive to it, that allure, I think kind of put me in that position a little bit.
You mentioned that you also have experience with sex work.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So I initially was a dominatrix. I also did a lot of body work. And when I decided to pursue my ASEC certification, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, I was met with the huge surprise that you can't do any kind of body work and be certified, which blew my mind. And there it was in this place where I thought, okay, well, this is about as liberated as we can get when it comes to sexuality and people really understanding. And suddenly here is this other holdover from purity culture kind of making its way in. And so I did decide to stop doing sex work so that I could get certified. And I am in the application process right now. But I found that with my lived experience as a sex worker, and a proud former sex worker, and I still absolutely would be doing it if I could hold certification. I want to be that go-between that also shows ASECT and other organizations that, the thing that like, so much of the success that you were built on was built on the backs of sex workers. So we need to pay homage and work with them because there's so much of that community experience that they can provide us and teach us.
100%. I mean, so many of the models I've interviewed are honestly almost, no, they are treated as therapists by the members that are coming to see them, talking about so many things. And when you're dealing so closely and so directly with people's sexuality every single day, all day, you have a lot of knowledge that you can share.
100%. And there's such a community, like a safety that they're creating for people that I think so much of us can learn from. And the world would be more of a beautiful, kind place, I think, if that just was able to exist outside of that too.
100. I completely agree. I've seen firsthand how people's lives have been changed through cam models on Live Jasmine, and I know various other forms of sex work. Just speaking from what I've personally heard members tell me, health issues they've had have gotten better with the relationships, and it makes sense when you realize how detrimental feeling lonely is to our health. I think they likened it to smoking several packs of cigarettes a day. When you feel deeply lonely, it is detrimental to health. So when you can find connection, no matter where it is, and you feel safe, like you mentioned, and not judged in a space where you can be yourself, share yourself, that is profoundly healing. That's not even that radical to say. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it is healing.
Absolutely. And I think we often look at people who seek out either chem services or sex work as like people who are lacking something. And a lot of them certainly are, but I think most of us could just benefit from having safer, more inclusive, sex positive spaces in general, even if we don't feel like we're lacking anything or missing anything.
Absolutely. What would you say was the biggest lesson you learned when you were working as a sex worker? Or
Oh gosh.
maybe
Yeah.
something you learned about human sexuality or just people in general or yourself?
Oh, yeah. What a great question. I think it just expands so much past physical penetrative sex, that sex can mean literally anything because intimacy can mean absolutely anything. It surprised me how rare it was for somebody to even want me to touch them. Most of the time, they wanted to just sit down and talk about their day, or they wanted to just cry with me. They wanted to just tell me the most random things. A lot of my work was also virtual, and most of the time it was a conversation like we were having. That completely surprised me because I thought that it was going to be much more of like a sensual conversation, but and it certainly was, but not always. More often than not, it wasn't. That I think surprised me the most. And what I learned so much about myself was finding pleasure in ways that I didn't think I could find pleasure. Just how important it is to find pleasure everywhere around you, because that can be somebody's reality, that can be your own reality. So just ways to find joy, ways to find pleasure, and that it's not always just the prescribed dominant narrative.
One thing that I find that's really beautiful, by the way, thank you for sharing. And I really love that. I love this idea, and I've heard it many times that many sex workers say when they first kind of get into the field, that's something that surprises them is that they realize this is not just about sex. In fact, that is just a part of it. It's about connection. Now, having said that, what would you say is one of the biggest lessons you've learned since you started your new career path and started coaching and kind of being the liaison, if you will, between,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I would say the biggest lesson I've learned kind of going into this is to honor your own boundaries, but also don't be afraid to question them. I started to think about why certain things are vilified, right? Like sex work or sexuality in general. I mean, when I think about like BDSM in particular, the argument is always, oh, well, it's unsafe. Oh, well, this physical harm is happening. But if I were to play American football, nobody would bat an eye, right? But we know that's unsafe. We know that brain damage happens. But for some reason, one of these is vilified because there's like this veil of sexuality to it. And so I started to kind of see all the ways in which we criminalize sex and pleasure, and for no real good reason. And once I start to kind of connect those dots, and I help people connect those dots, they're much more able and willing, I think, to then start to question other systems of oppression. And so it's led to more collective liberation than I think I initially anticipated in ways that I never would have expected. And I think a lot of people start to connect with themselves in that regard, and kind of heal their communities too through sexuality, which blew my mind, still blows my mind, honestly.
I can tell when you talk that you are a person who has a mission, who's very passionate about what they do.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, definitely. I'm curious, what would you say is one of your ultimate goals with your work and your purpose?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Oh, that question gets me misty-eyed because my ultimate goal is to be the person to be the person that I needed when I was first coming to terms with and being and realizing that I was different and that I wanted something different and that I was beginning to question things. My ultimate goal, even if I could just be that for one person, then I truly feel fulfilled, as stereotypical as that sounds. I want people to be able to have intimate connections with everybody around them, and in all the ways that they have agency and power, and to find their power in their sexuality and pleasure. That is my ultimate goal. However, I can figure out how to do that, all the different ways I can figure it out. Yeah, that would be it.
One thing that I find interesting about people in this field in regards to human sexuality, sexual health, and wellness is that many of them have an emphasis on people experiencing pleasure and intimacy in ways that may or may not have anything to do with intercourse. And I'm curious why you think that's so important. Why is it so important for people to be intimately connected with those around them or to seek out pleasure in all of its many forms?
Yeah, because I think the only narrative that we've ever gotten is one lens, one view of what pleasure looks like. And for so many of us, for so many different reasons, that either is a standard that we can't live up to or won't always live up to. We're all going to age. We're all going to have different abilities, different sexualities, sensualities, all these different variances. And it's so easy to look at this one narrative and think that we're inherently flawed and there's something wrong with us and we aren't worthy or capable of pleasure. And it's so upsetting, I think, frankly. And even as a sexologist, I sit there sometimes and I have to remind myself that just because how I love and feel good and feel pleasure doesn't look like this one particular view doesn't mean that it's wrong. And I think it's really important to expand that definition of what pleasure looks like for us, because at some point in all of our lives, we are going to need to expand beyond what we thought pleasure looked like, be it because we age, be it because our ability levels vary. And so, yeah, I think it's just, it's part being realistic about what we can expect our lives to look like. And on top of that, it's just, here's how we can make our experiences better. Even if our narrative does fit this and we are one of the lucky ones, here's how it can be better. So why not do that? Just why not be happier?
Are there physiological benefits to being in and experiencing pleasure? Does that have an effect on people's health or overall well-being?
Oh, 100% in so many different ways. I mean, human beings, we are social creatures. We can't exist in a vacuum. We have to exist in communities and whatever community can look like. And the way that we connect with people is through intimacy, and it's a scale. You have certain levels of consent and intimacy with different people, but even our conversation right now is a level of intimacy, and it's pleasure, and it's all these beautiful, wonderful things. And to try to get as close to that as we can. It just has such huge benefits, not just for us, but our communities, our families, our loved ones. I mean, that's really how we heal the world around us. Yeah, so I mean, I can't even begin to count all the benefits because there's so many beyond the otherwise.
I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on camming? I know you mentioned you had heard of Live Jasmine before. Had you heard of us before we contacted you, or?
Yeah, so I went to the Kinsey Institute. I completed their human sexuality program and spoke to Dr. Gesselman actually, and she told us about the study. And I had, heard of Live Jasmine. I hadn't used the service personally. And I'll admit that I definitely, before I started to become a sexologist and actually do this professionally, we all have our I guess stereotypical representation of what camming is. I never thought negatively of it. I just thought, okay, it's typically a young, femme presenting, attractive woman stripping on camera, which, like, hey, great. That's what I thought it was. And then as I started to get into this industry more, as I started to work with people, both as a sexologist and a sex worker, I started to see that it was so much more than that. And it's not much different than any like vanilla connection, right? Like your doctor could technically have like that kind of a connection with you. It's just one person is a different kind of intimacy than the other. So yeah, I'd heard of you, I knew of you. That was my thought about cam work. But yeah.
What are your thoughts on camming now?
I see camming as, I guess, both the connection and like cam models. I really see them as body workers and like healers in a way, almost like community healers is probably the best way I can like describe that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I interviewed a tantra teacher a while ago, and she brought up an ancient civilization. There have been a few apparently. I didn't really know this, but when men would go off to war and come back, before they were let back into the towns with their families and all of that, they had to go to these like temples where these priestesses or women would help them heal from whatever they had seen
Wow.
or been through, to kind of soften them back up and let them go back home instead of just like, bringing them straight from war and trauma and whatever had happened into the home
Yeah.
with their wives and kids, where they might be a little bit still in shock. And I had no idea about that. I found it so fascinating, but
That is
this,
incredible. Yeah.
right? And I guess there are a lot of books on this, that this did in fact happen. And she likened good cam models to kind of that in between world, if you will, for certain
Mm.
people who are just needing that softness, that connection, that healing. Um, I think it's like there is something very potent about female sexuality. That's why it's so policed.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons it's policed. There is a potent healing effect that it has. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
That is. And it also doesn't surprise me at the same time. We've seen so many instances of this throughout history, like courtesans, for example, were the most educated women. And when you look at history, I mean, all the world leaders and everything, there was always sexually liberated, femme presenting, primarily women who were more involved in the decisions than we really give them credit for. And the first thing to really be criminalized when we wanted to start to oppress certain groups of people was sexuality, was any deviance from this dominant narrative that they were trying to portray. So that was people of different gender representations, people of different sexualities, people of more collective sexualities, because when you are connected to sexuality, you are connected to kind of this collective. And so when you do break that almost like a sacred bond, that's how you oppress people. And that's how you can create that systemic oppression, is through criminalizing sexuality.
What would you say is one of the biggest either misconceptions or just outright lies that you see floating around about human sexuality?
Yeah, that it's all to do with orgasm. Can be. We love orgasms. They're fun, but so much of pleasure extends beyond that. And yeah, oh God, there's so many, but I think that's kind of the one that jumps out to me the most is unless you orgasm, then it is a failure. You have not experienced pleasure. So any kind of, I guess, goalpost, like there doesn't have to be a reason. It can just be for the sake of being.
Yeah. I mean, even if you don't orgasm, if you were connected with another human being or human beings, like that is deeply healing. Again, we're social creatures.
100%. Yeah. And like I said earlier, like our conversation now, I derive such pleasure from that. And that it can be so equally healing as like an intimate moment I have with an intimate partner, and in just different ways, but neither takes away from the other in a way too.
Right. Yeah, I think understanding that connection and pleasure can show up anywhere at any time. And that's what makes life actually a lot more fun when you can keep your eye out for it.
100%. And I think when you experience pleasure in one area, it's almost like a ripple effect on other areas of your life. And I find that whenever people connect to their sexuality, they start to kind of spread out that healing energy everywhere else and to other people.
If you could give one message to everyone in the world about human sexuality or human connection that you don't think the world is really up to speed on just yet, what would that message be?
Oh, what a great question though. What is one message that maybe people aren't up to speed on about sexuality that I wish I could or wish they would be, I guess. Ooh, I think, I was sitting there and I was thinking about it and I'm like, what is that one message? And I think ironically that there doesn't have to be a reason. There doesn't have to be this reason for something, be it pleasure for the sake of pleasure, connection for the sake of connection. Like we can just exist in pleasure, however we define that. It doesn't even have to have a definition. It doesn't even have to have a purpose. We can just kind of be as like floaty as that sounds, because I think we almost want to always ascribe meaning to something, but it doesn't necessarily have to. I think it's probably what I would say, because I think that really is a lot of what holds us back from seeking out pleasure too. Like, what is the reason, or what would people think, or what would I think? There always seems to be this drive for an answer that we may not get, and it's perfectly okay to sit in that discomfort a little bit, that discomfort of not knowing, because sometimes that can be the pleasure itself. So yeah, I would say just get away from any reason.
Yeah, that's something that I think is so fun about kids is that they just do things because they want to. And
Yeah.
they feel like, why did you color on the wall? Because felt good. It felt good. You know what I mean? Like they just do. There's no real reason or logic behind it. That's for sure. It's just they follow their pleasure. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that is so fun about kids and something that we can learn to from them and remember. Like that's kind of who we are innately, is these pleasure centered beings, and we just follow the pleasure because, like you said, there doesn't have to really be a reason or a logic or a strategy behind it. So I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's so interesting because we almost, convince children that they shouldn't be that way. We really can learn so much from kids, so much so. And yeah, being pleasure-centered beings, absolutely, you're right. That is who we always were. And I think, we start off that way, we get it kind of driven out of us, and then we end up trying to find our way back. And I think that's really the journey of sexuality.
That's the journey we're currently on right now, is trying to find our way back to feel
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. What are your thoughts on sex tech and AI and this new world that, I mean, it's not a new world, but AI is advancing very quickly, as you know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I honestly love it. I love how much more accessibility it's created because, again, going back to what that dominant narrative looks like, for a lot of people, loneliness that, we all experienced during COVID was nothing new for people of different ability levels, people of different cultures, people who live alternative sexualities have always had a sense of isolation. And I think that AI and technology and sex tech has opened doors to experiencing pleasure and connection that we didn't anticipate before. I think that we definitely need to understand a lot of the implications in terms of consent, in terms of privacy. But I think it's opened a lot of doors that we didn't necessarily think could before. Like it's a lot easier now to have a long distance relationship than otherwise, especially like on a sexual intimate level. Like that's incredible. And for a lot of people, like for me personally, having disabilities, COVID was really much more isolating, I think, for me than it was for a lot of people I know. And having the ability to have sex tech at my disposal to connect with my partners really helped me feel like I was actually there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is the beautiful thing about technology and AI. While there are some concerning areas of it, one of the
Mhm.
most beautiful parts that for me I think is worth the risk and all of it is kind of what you touched on, this aspect of being able now to connect from anywhere at any time in such a profound way, like
Yeah.
imagine, I mean, I grew up in the 90s and video calls like this from somewhere, that really was not a thing. We have moved very quickly,
Yes.
very quickly. Um, but yeah, I think that that is the beautiful thing of technology, is that it is connecting us from where we are to all over the world instantly. And that's actually something whenever I ask a model or a member, like, what's one of your favorite aspects of Live Jasmine? They'll say, well, I get to connect with someone from this part of the world and I figure out like what life is like there or how things are done with
Yeah.
culture. It's almost like this education, this cultural education, because they're connecting with so many different people from all over the world. And I also love that. I've met so many friends on social media myself.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. And seeing just what sexuality and pleasure and intimacy looks like across the world has been incredible. And a lot of my work, revolves around cultural competency and learning. And the world feels both bigger and smaller because of how many doors technology has opened. And I quite love the fact that we're now investing in exploring sexuality and pleasure through technology. It's like pleasure for the sake of pleasure in a way, is how sex tech feels.
Yeah, yes, pleasure for the sake of pleasure. That's a great way of putting it. And that is the message that I think a lot of sex educators and coaches and therapists are kind of bringing forth, is that there's this permission that's being given to have pleasure for the sake of pleasure, not because your partner wants to or because you shouldn't, because society says so, but just
Yeah.
whatever feels good, just do it.
Yeah. There
Which
doesn't have to be a reason.
there
Yeah.
doesn't have to be a reason, but I can see why that is scary for people, because imagine, giving a 5-year-old a box of crayons and just saying, just have whatever you want, have at it, it's like they're gonna color on the walls, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
because it feels good. So I can understand why certain systems are trying to keep us away from our pleasure. They're nervous about what could happen. And
Oh,
rightfully
for
so.
sure.
You never know what could happen.
Oh yeah, 5-year-old with a box of crayons. So as creative as they can get. Yeah, but then I also, using that same example, the worst thing that happens is we just have to paint over a section of the wall. Like, how
Right.
much does that really take away from our lives to where we have to then, I mean, having young nibblings myself, I'm like, don't just leave them out with a box of crayons, right? But I'm like, at the same time, what they walk away with, is life lessons, connection, and all these kind of abstract concepts that we work so hard to teach them. Yeah, so
Joy, pleasure. Like, yeah. I want to kind of touch on this conversation that we kind of started before we were in the interview about how it is for you and how you feel kind of living in a very sexually conservative state and being a sex educator.
oh gosh, yeah, it's definitely got its scary moments. Like I've had death threats. I've had those really scary, serious moments, but at the same time, even in the worst case scenarios, when I am experiencing that hostility, there is, as stereotypical as it sounds, it's a cry for help. There's such a need for it here. Anytime I've taught any kind of sexuality, any kind of intimacy class, it's always been so well attended because people are just so in need of it, but so scared of it, and it's heartbreaking, but it's also really beautiful to see them kind of wanting to be empowered in that way. I found like there's more of a need for it than we would think, and especially any kind of pleasure or sexuality that looks different from the norm. Um, there's almost more of a sacredness to it because you don't see it that often. It's much more risky. So people appreciate it a lot more, and people don't realize how much they need it. That's what I see a lot of in terms of kind of existing in this. I mean, a lot of my work honestly revolves around telling people that they have permission to just be, and also reminding myself that it's okay for me to exist in this vulnerable space and feel vulnerable and scared. And I do, at times a lot, but I also feel so empowered. So I think, yeah, it's innately human. And I think most of my work is reminding myself of that and teaching people that.
Yeah, beautiful. If there's anyone listening who's like, okay, I have realized I am not living a pleasurable life. My work, as many, I think many Americans for sure, it's very easy in our hustle culture to get very caught up in being goal and achievement based, where again, that logic and reasoning comes in for everything. Does this make sense? What will be my reward if I get it or if this happens? There's a lack of just chasing pleasure for the sake of pleasure. And so if someone's listening and they're like, wow, I really realize that I'm not living a pleasurable life. In fact, my life is uncomfortable or it's stressful or it doesn't feel good. What would you say is like a beginning place for them to start to move in the direction of living a more pleasurable life?
Yeah, it's going to sound so contrary to what I've said, but don't be afraid of the structure a little bit. Like, I'm neurodivergent. I need lists. I'm very much a list and spreadsheet person. How my journey started was creating a spreadsheet for my kinks and fetishes, as wild as that sounds. Because I wanted some structure. I wanted to understand. I wanted to make a list of all the things, and I wanted to be able to have a tool to journal from, to figure out what this means, to figure out what kind of things I'm into and want. And so it started off there, and I kind of quite loved the fact that I could say I have a spreadsheet for my sexuality, and people were more interested in it than not. And to this day, it's a resource that people often request. I have a blank version that I have free available on my website for anyone. But don't be afraid of that structure if that's what you need. and have those continuous conversations with yourself of, what does pleasure look like for me? What does this mean for me? What is something like flogging can mean so many different things for people. So what does it mean for me? And why do I like it? And don't ask those questions because you feel like you have to give an answer to somebody. Ask those questions because you're exploring it. So make the exploration fun. Don't be afraid of the structure, and just continue to learn and explore. I think, yeah, like you said, the hustle culture is we try to find the reason and to kind of reach a goal, not because we're having fun in that journey, but because we have to reach this goal to meet this metric. But really it's kind of the whole journey there is the purpose.
My final question to you is, on either a collective level or an individual level, what would you say are our next steps in laying the foundation for a more sexually positive society or sexually well society?
Yeah, next steps. Understanding the agency of consent, as wild of a concept as that sounds, understanding that your empowerment stems from your agency to give and receive consent, and empowering those around you to have that same agency is how we experience the most pleasure and how we are able to then heal our collective communities. I think agency above all, and the ability to decide what that looks like for you, is how we ultimately define pleasure for ourselves, how we're able to create it, and how we're able to then, it's kind of the root of sex positivity and of reproductive justice and just justice in general. So I think that's kind of the next step is understand that your right to pleasure stops at somebody else's right to pleasure, and you should want that for them as much as you want that for yourself. Yeah, I would say that's kind of the next step, and from that, when we have the agency to explore and to play, really that's where pleasure stems from.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was such a wonderful experience. Thank you so much.
That makes me happy to hear.